Tonight, we shall fall asleep to the entire story of the Trojan Horse. It is a story about Odysseus's cunning, about how one man, looking at war not as a soldier but as a thinker, achieved what 10 years of siege could not. For 10 years, the greatest heroes of Greece had battered the walls of Troy, and the walls had not fallen. It was only when Odysseus conceived his plan, bold, almost mad, that everything changed. He understood, force cannot be defeated by force. Only the mind can accomplish what swords cannot. And so began an operation of breathtaking intricacy, a deception demanding flawless timing, absolute secrecy, and a gift so irresistible that no enemy could refuse it. Tonight, we shall uncover every detail of this legendary scheme, how it was born, how it was prepared, and how it was executed on that fateful night when Troy finally fell. We will step inside the wooden horse, stand beside those who waited in the darkness, and watch as one of the greatest deceptions in military history unfolds. Make yourself comfortable, close your eyes, and let this story, the story of one of the craftiest strategies ever devised, carry you into a deep and restful sleep. And if you leave a like or a comment on the plateau of Plato, the ancient god of dreams, Morpheus himself, will open for you his secret chest, marked with a green branch, and grant you one of those dreams that visit only those who have not yet forgotten how to wonder. Odysseus came out of his tent at the very edge of the Greek camp and stopped, gazing at the sunset that slowly faded over Troy. The sky above the city was still warm, gold, crimson, and soft pink mingled in the last light of day, but the shadows were already beginning to lengthen, and the air was growing cooler. The sea at the horizon was smooth, almost black, and somewhere above it the first star was already beginning to shine. The wind, soft and salty, carried the smell of smoke from the city. There they were lighting the evening fires, preparing dinner, and this smoke was warm and familiar, like the breath of a hearth, but it mingled with the smell of grass trampled by soldiers' feet, and with the smell of salt from the ships rotting on the shore. Odysseus stood motionless, and his thoughts were as heavy as the weariness that had accumulated in his muscles and bones over the decades. 10 years. For 10 years he had stared at these walls of Troy, high, gray, impregnable. They rose upon the plain as if the earth itself had birthed them to protect the city from all who dared to approach. He knew that within those walls, they too were watching the sunset. The Trojans were looking at the same fiery orb descending below the horizon, and were also thinking about how much longer this would go on. And as he stood, gazing at the darkening stones, he remembered a story he had heard in childhood, when he had not yet worn a beard, when he did not know the taste of sea water, when he had never gripped a spear aimed at an enemy. It was on Parnassus, in a cave that smelled of herbs and old leather, where his maternal grandfather Autolycus sat by the fire and told him stories he would remember for life. Autolycus was the most famous and cunning thief in all of Greece, the son of Hermes, the god not only of trade but also of trickery, and from Hermes he inherited the gift of making invisible what he stole, and of changing the form of things so that their owners could not recognize them. As you understand, it was from his grandfather that Odysseus received his cunning, not from the gods of war, not from heroes of strength, but from the old wolf who knew that the world is a game where the mind wins. And then, sitting by the fire in his grandfather's cave, Odysseus first heard the story of how the walls of Troy were built. The gods, his grandfather said, in those times still walked the earth and did not hide from mortals behind the clouds of Olympus. Zeus, wishing to test their pride and patience, commanded two great gods, Poseidon and Apollo, to build the walls around Troy, a city that was to become the greatest in the world. Poseidon, whose power shattered cliffs, laid stone upon stone with such precision that even the wind could not find a gap between them. Apollo tended the herds of Laomedon on the slopes of Mount Ida, and his golden hair shone in the rays of the sun as he led the animals through the green meadows. For a whole year they labored, and their hands, accustomed to lightning and lyres, touched rough stone, turning it into perfection. The walls grew high, strong, eternal, and when the last stone was laid in its place, the gods came to King Laomedon for payment. But the king refused. He called them deceivers and said that the gods do not take payment for what they should do for men. The gods departed, indignant, and their wrath fell upon the city. Poseidon sent a sea monster that emerged from the water and devoured people on the shore, and Apollo sent a plague that cut down the inhabitants faster than swords. Troy suffered, and the oracle declared that the only way to appease the gods was to sacrifice the king's daughter, the beautiful Hesione, to the monster. Laomedon, in despair, agreed and ordered her to be chained to a rock by the sea. But the gods did not abandon the beautiful Hesione, who was destined to be born to such a greedy father who did not pay on time for the services rendered. The gods arranged it so that Heracles happened to be sailing by, and he saw the girl chained to the rock. He offered to save her in exchange for the immortal horses that Zeus had given to Laomedon. The king agreed, and Heracles slew the monster. But when the time came to pay, Laomedon refused again. He drove Heracles away with insults. The hero departed, but after some time returned with an army, took Troy by storm, killed Laomedon and all his sons, sparing only the youngest, Priam, who grew up and became the last king of Troy. It would seem, live and rejoice, but the shadow of deception remained upon the city like a fateful seal. The walls of Troy, built by the gods, still held, but the seed of retribution for the deception, sealed within them, awaited its hour. Odysseus caught his breath. He looked again at the walls, and suddenly noticed how, one by one, lights appeared upon them. The Trojan warriors were lighting torches, setting the night watch. Somewhere above, voices were heard, the guard was changing, and the clatter of weapons mingled with the night wind. Odysseus saw shadows moving along the crenellated walls, saw the light of torches dancing on the stones, and heard, somewhere in the distance, a dog barking, and the sound of the sea, and the crackling of wood in the campfires. The city was preparing for sleep, but its defenders were not sleeping. And then Odysseus, looking at these lights, at this eternal watch, suddenly remembered another day, the day when he, still very young, stood in Sparta, among kings and heroes, and courted Helen. He smiled at this thought, not bitterly, no, but rather with the light irony of a man long accustomed to the fact that he had never been the strongest or the richest. However, cunning was never something he lacked, and he still found a way to win himself a different, but equally wonderful bride. One that, in other circumstances, no one would have given him in marriage either. Odysseus proposed an interesting solution to Helen's father Tyndareus, who was afraid to choose one candidate over another as a husband for his daughter, lest he make enemies. The cunning king of Ithaca suggested that his prospective father-in-law bind all the suitors with a common agreement. Altogether, they would swear to protect whoever had the fortune to become the husband of the beautiful Helen from any external military threat. That is, they would form a military defensive alliance, and only after this would Helen herself choose a suitor of her heart. This idea pleased everyone, and all the suitors participated in the oath ceremony. They stood upon the dismembered pieces of a sacrificed horse and swore to protect Helen's choice. None of them could have imagined that one day they would have to keep their word, because now, as it seemed, no one in their right mind in all the Mediterranean would go to war against the city of the groom whom Tyndareus and Helen would prefer to all others, no matter what. Odysseus, in reward for his wise advice, received consent to marry Tyndareus's niece Penelope, the daughter of King Icarius, and she soon became his lawful wife, and he loved her. He closed his eyes, and her face appeared before him again, gentle, patient, with eyes that always looked at him with hope. He thought that then, on that day, he had found not only a wife, but also his peace for the rest of his days. But fate, as it turned out, had long been weaving its threads. Paris, the son of the Trojan king Priam, did not think of oaths when he seduced Helen and took her from Sparta. Perhaps because, although he was a prince by blood, he grew up among shepherds on the slopes of Mount Ida, far from royal palaces and diplomatic councils. He had not received the education that would have matched his status, and did not fully understand how serious the consequences could be of disregarding geopolitical treaties. And such an agreement was the oath of Tyndareus, an alliance that bound all of Helen's suitors with a common oath to protect her chosen husband. Perhaps he was blinded by Helen's beauty, the very beauty still spoken of as the embodiment of perfection, a face that could ignite a war, a body before which empires fall. Or perhaps he yielded to the will of Aphrodite, who on Mount Ida, when he chose between her, Hera, and Athena, had promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. And even after this scandal broke out, the war could still have been prevented. The Greeks did not immediately take up arms. Before raising their swords and assembling a fleet, they attempted to settle the matter peacefully. An embassy was sent to Troy, Menelaus, the insulted husband himself, and Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, who always knew how to find words even in the most hopeless situations. They arrived in the city and appeared before King Priam and the Trojan council, demanding that Helen be handed over and the treasures that Paris had taken with her be returned. This was the last chance to avoid bloodshed. If the Trojans had agreed, if they had returned Helen and apologized, the war would not have happened. But they refused. The Trojans, blinded by pride and unwilling to admit their guilt, decided to keep Helen for themselves. Moreover, some of them, it is said, even wanted to kill the envoys, and only the wise Antenor, in whose house the Greeks were staying, saved them from certain death. Odysseus raised his eyes again to the walls and fixed his gaze on that part of the city where Antenor's house stood, the most prudent of the Trojan elders. He remembered that house well, broad, with high doors, at which a leopard skin hung during the embassy. There, in the cool half-light of the inner courtyard, which smelled of honey and cedar, where water murmured in a stone basin, Odysseus and Menelaus spent several days awaiting the decision of the Trojan council. Antenor's wife, Theano, a priestess of Athena, appeared in the house silently, like a shadow, and one evening, when Odysseus sat alone by the hearth, she brought him a bowl of warm wine, in which pieces of dried apples floated. She did not speak a word, but in her eyes was the same anxiety that was in his own soul, a premonition that all this would end badly, that Troy would not give up Helen, and that the fire of war was already kindled. Odysseus then thought that she perhaps knew more than she said, but he did not ask. He simply accepted the bowl and thanked her with a look. Now, standing before these walls, he knew that her premonitions had come true, and that the war he had tried to prevent had already lasted 10 years. By the way, I will tell you now, so that you may listen to our nighttime story peacefully and not worry about the good man. Antenor's house would be spared when Troy fell. The Greeks remembered his hospitality and his courage when he forbade the Trojans from killing the envoys, and over his doors the leopard skin would still hang, as a sign that no warrior should enter that house with a sword. But that would come later. For now, Odysseus looked at that part of the city and thought that even in the most hostile city, there are people who remember human dignity. And this thought, strange and bitter, remained with him as he turned and headed toward the far part of the Danai camp, to his tent, leaving behind him the walls built by the gods and the city that was destined to fall. Odysseus wiped his eye, into which a particle of ash from a campfire, stirred up by the wind, had fallen. Everywhere in the military camp, evening fires were burning, and he again raised his gaze to the walls of Troy. Among the towers silhouetted against the dark sky, he noticed one, narrow, tall, standing apart. He knew that there, in that tower, the daughter of King Priam was imprisoned, whose name was Cassandra. She was a priestess of Apollo, and the god had endowed her with the gift of prophecy, but cursed her so that no one would ever believe her words. And when she cried out about the coming destruction, people laughed at her, and her father, tired of her hysterics, ordered her to be locked in the tower so that she would not disturb the people. Now she sits there, watching the sunset and seeing the future that no one wants to know. Odysseus looked at her tower and thought that perhaps it was she, the one whom no one listens to, who knew the truth. But he dismissed this thought, because now he needed to think not of prophecies, but of how to break down these walls. Odysseus was already standing at his tent, and the evening wind touched his face, and he knew that tonight he would not sleep again. Because his mind was working, searching for a way out, searching for a way that would allow him, a simple mortal, to do what the gods could not, destroy what they had built. At the very time when Odysseus, bending low, entered his tent and lowered the flap, preparing to lie down to sleep, on the other side of the walls of Troy, in the high palace of Priam, in the women's quarters, where it smelled of cedar and dried herbs, an old servant was silently passing from room to room on the stone floor, a woman who still remembered the Trojan campaign of Heracles. For even in those times she had served the royal family, though then she had been just a girl assigned to the kitchen to clean vegetables. The servant finished lighting the evening lamps. One by one, the flames flickered on the clay bowls, chasing the gathering twilight from the corners. Helen herself remained motionless, sitting in the carved wooden chair by the very window, not turning her head. She seemed not to notice that the light in the room had changed, that the fabric had blocked the darkening sky, and that her own shadow on the floor had begun to dance because the living flame of the oil lamp was burning. She simply continued to look at the curtain, at the place where the sunset had just been, where, it seemed to her, the boundary between sky and sea was still visible, between past and future, between the freedom she had lost and the life she had chosen. And in this silence, in this stillness, when the world outside the window had already plunged into night, and in the room only the oil lamps flickered and the fire in the hearth crackled softly, she was alone, completely alone with her memory, with her weariness, and with the thoughts that had not left her for 10 years. Helen was still beautiful of face and slender of body, but in her eyes, which had once kindled passion in the hearts of kings and heroes, There was no spark of joy, no gleam of pride. She looked at her hands, beautiful, well cared for hands of a queen, hands that had never known hard work, hands that had held the golden cup from which she drank wine during night caresses in the bed of Paris, and the precious rings she wore to remain beautiful for a man she had long despised. Helen now remembered her native Sparta every day, the gray stones of the palace, the cold halls where she had been not so much the wife of Menelaus as a trophy, a symbol of his power, his fortune. She was the daughter of Zeus, the sister of the Dioscuri, but in the Spartan palace she was merely a queen whose main purpose was to bear heirs and adorn feasts with her presence. She remembered how Menelaus, her husband, looked at her, with pride, but without warmth, as one looks at a precious object that belongs to you by right. And she remembered that when Paris, the handsome and persistent prince, promised her a different life, a life where she would be not merely an ornament to the throne, but a woman who was loved and admired, she believed him. She thought that in Troy everything would be different, that here she could be free, that Paris would love her as she had dreamed, and most importantly, that she could be mistress of herself. But it turned out that in Troy her position had not changed. She was still the wife of a prince, the mother of his children, but now, in addition to this, she was also the cause of the war, the guilty party for thousands of deaths. She looked at her hands, thin, pale, with long fingers, which had only ever touched jewels and silk, and understood that these hands could change nothing, neither stop the war, nor bring back the dead, nor make her children happy. She was a prisoner in a golden cage, and this cage was her own choice. She had chosen it when she agreed to leave with Paris, and now every day she paid for that choice. During the quiet of the evening, when the women's quarters settled into stillness, Helen would often hear the bright, carefree laughter of children drifting from the room next door, where the nurses were already easing them toward sleep. The nightly ritual of bedtime in the Trojan palace began as the sun sank below the rim of the earth and the shadows lengthened across the floors. 3 young servants, maidens from noble Trojan families, would put out all but one of the oil lamps in the sleeping chamber, where the children were already lying on low wooden beds spread with fleeces. The beds, though plain, were stoutly made, with thick legs and crossbars laced with leather thongs that supported mattresses of wool and dried grasses. Light canopies of linen hung above each bed, warding off the evening chill and keeping the buzzing insects at bay. The eldest, Eunomus, who had already turned 5, tried to seem grown up, lying with his eyes closed, but sometimes he would open one eye to check if he was missing anything important. Aegon and Idaeus, twins who were barely 3 years old, fidgeted on their wide bed, pulling the edges of the woolen blankets from each other until the nurse wagged her finger at them. Little Helen, named after her mother, slept in a separate cradle, woven from the nurse, an elderly woman who knew hundreds of tales and legends, sat down on a low bench by the hearth, where the coals were dying, and began to hum softly an ancient melody, neither quite a lullaby nor quite a prayer, the words of which were understood only by her and, perhaps, the gods. Her voice was low and warm, like the coals in the hearth, and the children who had been fidgeting and laughing just moments before began to quiet down, listening to the familiar sounds. She sang to them the story of a brave hunter and a wild boar that lived in the forests on the slopes of Ida, a story they had heard 100 times and which, like all good stories, only improved with repetition. So it was this evening as well. Helen heard that the children were being put to sleep, stirred, rose, and walked to the children's room. She stood in the doorway and looked at them. Eunomus was already almost asleep, his breathing steady and deep. The twins lay close together. Little Helen, named after her, slept in her cradle, her little fist clenched, her face serene, like all children who do not yet know the worries of the adult world. Helen looked at them and remembered another room, another palace, there in Sparta. She remembered Hermione, her daughter by Menelaus, who had been only a few years old when she left with Paris. She remembered how the little girl, small and defenseless, stood on the threshold and cried, reaching out her arms to her. Helen did not turn back. She thought that in Troy she would have a new life, new love, new children. And she did not know that she was leaving behind not just a husband and a palace, but that part of herself which she could never recover. And now, looking at her sleeping children, she felt the pain of the child she had abandoned. The nurse finished her song, and silence fell in the room. Only the breathing of the sleeping children and the crackling of the dying coals broke it. Helen went to each bed, adjusted the blankets, touched Eunomus's hair, stroked the twins' heads. She leaned over little Helen's cradle, and when her fingers touched her daughter's cheek, the girl smiled in her sleep, as if sensing her mother's presence. She straightened and looked at the window. Somewhere out there, beyond the walls of Troy, the Greek camp stood, and in one of the tents, perhaps, Menelaus was not sleeping, the very man she had once chosen herself, who was her true lawful husband, the father of her first daughter. She remembered how she had chosen him, how it had been. She stood in the middle of the inner courtyard of her father Tyndareus's palace in Sparta, and all the suitors looked at her, and she looked only at him and knew she would choose him, because in his eyes there was none of that greed and unhealthy passion that was in the eyes of the others. In Menelaus's eyes there was a silence, a calm confidence that soothed her, and besides, he was to her taste and very handsome, and she thought then that next to this man she would find peace. And in the first months of their marriage, when they were alone in the evening silence of the Spartan palace, she felt almost happy, not that bright, noisy joy described by poets, but a quiet, almost invisible happiness, like the warmth of a hearth on a cool evening. She remembered how he looked at her when they were first married, with that strange tenderness of a man not accustomed to showing his feelings, but unable to hide them, and she rejoiced that she was his wife. And now, after so many years, she stood at the window in a foreign city, in a foreign palace, and thought about how strangely fate is arranged, which first gives you what you want, and then takes it away when you least expect it. She had not seen Menelaus on the day she left. He was far away, on Crete. She had not seen his eyes, and now, remembering this, she understood that it was perhaps for the best. She could not have borne his gaze, that very gaze she remembered from the first days of their marriage, when he looked at her as if she were the only light in his life. And here, in this palace in Troy, beside her there was no longer the one for whom she had once left Sparta. Paris was dead, slain by Philoctetes with an arrow from the bow of Heracles, and she learned of it when his body was brought to the palace, and she stood at the door and watched as his brothers laid him on his bed, and her eyes were dry, because she had long ceased to love him. She looked at his face, which had once seemed to her the most beautiful in the world, and saw simply the face of a man she had once known, but no longer remembered. She had grown cold toward Paris long ago, perhaps from the very beginning, when she understood that his promises were nothing more than words, and his love nothing more than a whim that faded as quickly as it had flared. But what killed her feelings was not even that. She saw how Paris behaved on the battlefield. He avoided battles, hid behind the backs of his brothers, found thousands of reasons not to go out against the enemy. She watched him be a coward, and a quiet, cold contempt grew within her, stronger than any disappointment. She could not respect a man who was willing to risk everything for her beauty, but was not willing to risk his life for her honor. She looked at him and saw not a hero, but a coward who had promised her peace and brought her war. And when he died, she felt neither pain nor relief, only emptiness, as if a man who had long been a stranger to her had departed. Now Helen was the wife of Deiphobus, Paris's brother. He had seized the fortunate opportunity and simply by law, with joy, took her as his wife after his brother's death, as the ancient custom demanded, and now she lived with him in the same palace, in the same room where she had once shared a bed with Paris. She passed from hand to hand, like an object, like a trophy that passes from one victor to another, and this thought was the bitterest of all. She thought that her beauty had not brought her happiness, but had turned her into an object, a trophy, a thing, and she could no longer do anything about it. She was Helen the Beautiful, wife now of one man, now of another, mother of children who bore foreign names, and in this endless succession of husbands she had ceased to distinguish where she ended and where the role imposed upon her began. She remembered how once, in her youth, she had heard a prophecy that her fate would be bound to 5 men, and then she had laughed at it, because it seemed to her that she herself chose her life. Now she no longer laughed. She knew that her life had been written in advance by 3 goddesses who had not asked her consent, and this thought was heavier than all the stones from which the walls of Troy were built. The 3 Greek goddesses of fate, the Moirai, who spin the thread of every human life, measure it, and cut it at its hour, had long ago determined her path, and she was merely a bright thread in the complex pattern of ancient Greek history. The ancient poets would later tell in their long and bitter narratives that first she became the semi-legitimate wife of Theseus, who kidnapped her when she was still a girl. Then came Menelaus, her lawful husband, whom she chose herself. Then Paris, because of whom the war began. Now Deiphobus, to whom she came by custom. And ahead of her, while Odysseus in his tent was sinking into a heavy, restless sleep, his mind, not yet knowing the answer, continued to search for a way out. And he had no idea that tomorrow the very thought would come to him that would change the course of the war, the thought of the wooden horse that would turn the tide of history. And in another part of Troy, in a high tower with a small window barred by a grating, the Trojan horse was already being awaited with horror by the one who saw the future, who saw Odysseus's future plan as already accomplished. The cursed prophetess Cassandra had already seen this plan long before it was born in Odysseus's mind. She knew about the horse, about the warriors inside, about the fall of Troy, and she knew that her voice would again not be heard. And this thought, which she carried within her, was heavier than all the stones from which the walls of her city were built. Cassandra sat on a narrow stone bench by the very window, and her face, pale in the light of the fading day, was frozen with the expression of a person who sees too much and has ceased to hope that anyone will want to listen. Her long dark hair, still glossy and well-groomed despite the wartime, fell in strands over her shoulders. The braids of the royal daughter's hairstyle had already been undone for sleep by the servant who attended to Cassandra at Priam's command. Her gaze was fixed into the distance, where the sunset painted the sky in the same colors in which her city would burn when the end came. She remembered the day when it all began, the day that changed her life and made her the one whom everyone fears and no one listens to. She was only a few years old then, and she was just like all children, carefree, laughing, believing that the world was simple and fair. She and her twin brother Helenus, as often happens with twins, were inseparable. They played together, learned together, hid together in the far corners of the palace when they grew tired of the bustle of adults. And on that day, during a festival in the temple of Apollo that stood on the Trojan plain, tired of the noise, they crept into a far corner of the sanctuary and fell asleep. No one looked for them. The adults, drunk on wine and dancing, forgot about the children. The servants, of whom there were too many and too few at the same time, did not notice their absence. The temple emptied, and only the smell of burnt offerings and incense still hung in the air, mingling with the scent of honey and old stone. They slept on the cold floor, pressed close to each other, when the sacred snakes that lived in the temple slithered out of their hiding places and coiled around them. No one knows what happened in those minutes. No one knows what the snakes did, why they did not bite the children, why they did not attack, but simply lay motionless, touching the ears of Cassandra and her brother with their forked tongues. When the servants finally realized and ran to the temple, they saw it, the snakes coiled around the royal children, and froze in horror. But the snakes, hearing their cries, silently slipped into the shadows and vanished, leaving behind only the smell of earth and sacred oil. From that day on, Cassandra and her brother became different. They heard what others did not hear. They saw what had not yet happened. They understood the language of the wind and the birds, and the future opened before them like an open book that could not be closed. But if Helenus, who inherited the gift of prophecy, used it with caution and remained in the shadows, Cassandra did not know how to be silent. She spoke what she saw, and her words frightened people. She predicted the death of Paris when he was still a child and begged them to kill him. She predicted the war when Helen still lived in Sparta. She predicted fires and death, and every time her voice drowned in the noise of festivals and the laughter of courtiers who did not want to hear the truth. Now she sat in the tower that her father had ordered locked, so that she would not disturb the people with her dark prophecies. She was a prisoner not in chains, but in a stone cage from which there was no escape. And she looked at the sunset and saw the future that no one wanted to see. She saw the wooden horse that had not yet been built, but which already stood before her inner eye, huge, dark, with an empty belly into which the enemy warriors had not yet entered, but in which death had already taken refuge. She saw the Trojans dragging it into the city, and at night warriors emerging from its belly, and the gates opening, and the Greeks bursting into Troy, and fire devouring the houses. She saw all of this, but when she spoke, people laughed. When she cried out, they stopped their ears. When she begged, they turned away. And now, when night had fallen upon the city, and the last rays of sunset had faded beyond the horizon, she remained sitting at the window, gazing into the darkness, and her lips moved, uttering words that no one heard. They built us on deception, and by deception we shall perish. Somewhere below, in the Greek camp, Odysseus tossed in his sleep, and his mind, not yet knowing the answer, searched for a way out. He did not know that his plan had already been seen by the eyes of the one whom no one listened to, and that his victory had already been paid for by the death of a city that did not want to hear the truth. He did not know that his own cunning, however brilliant, had already been foretold by the one whose voice had fallen silent in the stone tower, as the wind falls silent when it has exhausted itself. Troy was a great city, and within its walls, behind which the Greek army had stood for 10 years, life continued, not the heroic life of which songs were sung, but the most ordinary, everyday life, with its smells, sounds, and rituals that repeated day after day. Even when the cries of battle were heard from outside, even when the archers on the walls drew their bowstrings, inside the city people baked bread, traded in the markets, and put their children to sleep. War had become part of their lives, like breathing or the change of day and night, and they had learned to live with it because they had no other choice. Whenever the clatter of clay dishes or the muffled laughter of a child was heard somewhere in a house, it seemed that these sounds were a quiet challenge that the city threw at time, refusing to acknowledge its doom. The markets still functioned, though goods had become scarcer and prices had risen, and merchants who once brought lapis lazuli and carnelian to Troy now feared to approach the city, knowing that Greek ships prowled along the coast. Potters, whose workshops were located right by the wall, fired pots and jugs in kilns fueled by wood from the olive groves, and their voices called out to the voices of townspeople going to the wells for water. In the houses, built of stone and clay, with flat roofs and thick walls that protected against summer heat and winter cold, hearths burned, and above them, on spits, meat roasted, smelling of garlic and thyme, and this smell mingled with the smell of dry grass and dust that rose from the streets when people walked along them. Children played in the streets as they always had, and their laughter, bright and carefree, echoed through the narrow alleys. They ran along the stone steps leading to the city gates, hid behind the clay jars that stood by the doors, and played the same games their parents had played when they were children, and only occasionally their play was interrupted by the sound of trumpets from the city walls, and then they would pause for a moment, listening to what was happening beyond the walls, and then run again, because children cannot be afraid for long. The old men sat by the gates, on stone benches worn by time into the walls, and discussed the news brought to them by neighbors or servants. They spoke of how much longer the siege would last, of how another of the king's sons had died yesterday, of how the grain supplies, though stored in large jars buried in the floors beneath the houses, were still not endless. In their voices there was no longer the confidence that had been there in the first year of the war, when everyone believed the Greeks would soon tire and leave. Now they spoke more quietly, and in their eyes was that weariness that comes to people who have lived too long in expectation of the end, that same weariness which, it seemed to them, had begun to seep through the stones of their own walls, making them slightly less reliable, slightly more permeable to the wind and to fear. And yet Troy held on, and it held on not least because it was not only Trojans who had gathered behind its walls. Allies flocked to the city, peoples and tribes who, despite the danger, sent their contingents to aid the besieged city. Homer, who would later record this story in his Iliad, would list them: the Thracians, who came from the European shore of the Dardanelles, the Paeonians with their long bows, the Paphlagonians from the shores of the Black Sea, the Mysians, Phrygians, Carians, and Lycians, commanded by Sarpedon, the son of Zeus himself, and his cousin Glaucus. This was not merely an alliance based on fear or coercion, but rather a gathering of equal peoples who stood in defense of the city because they understood that the fall of Troy would change everything: the fragile balance of power in Anatolia, the trade routes, the fates of their own kingdoms. They came from Mysia, Coria, and Phrygia, and each of them brought not only weapons but also a belief that Troy, this ancient, impregnable city, would survive the siege. Hector, when he addressed his army, called them not merely warriors, but brave Trojans and allies renowned from afar. And in this address there was not only pride, but also a quiet, almost silent plea that they would not abandon the city in its darkest hour. And among these allies were those who came not from distant lands, but from the nearby cities of the Troad, the Dardanians led by Aeneas, the son of Aphrodite, the people of Zelia, Adrystia, Percote. They knew that if Troy fell, their own lands would lie open to Greek ships and Greek swords. And this knowledge gave them strength as they stood on the walls and looked out at the plain where the lights of the enemy camp flickered like cold stars fallen to earth. They knew that their own homes, their fields, and their children also depended on whether the walls of Troy would hold, and this thought was heavier for them than any armor they wore on their shoulders. And yet, despite the help of the allies, despite the impregnable walls and the grain supplies hidden in jars buried in the floors, the Trojans felt time working against them. Each day their hope grew more fragile, like old fabric that begins to unravel at the edges, and they no longer knew how much longer they could hold on. They knew that beyond the walls awaited not only the Greeks, but also that same weariness that was their most terrible enemy, a weariness that seeped into every house, every family, every heart, as dampness seeps into an old house, which can be driven out by neither fire nor sun. And when night fell upon the city, and torches were lit on the walls, and the last voices fell silent in the streets, Troy fell asleep with that same heavy sleep that all cities sleep who live in expectation of the end. But this sleep was restless, and in their dreams people heard footsteps approaching their doors, and saw fire devouring their homes, and woke in a cold sweat, not knowing whether it was a premonition or simply fear that had settled in their hearts and refused to leave. It seemed to them that the walls built by the gods had begun to breathe in time with their own fear, and that somewhere in the darkness that very Cunning had already taken refuge, which they did not suspect, but which had already been seen by the eyes of the one whom no one listened to. If in Troy life still flickered, warmed by the glow of hearths and the voices of children, then in the Greek camp, spread along the shore beside the beached ships, it was quite different. There were no women, no children, no familiar smell of bread from ovens, and nothing reminded one of home. Only the sea, which was as foreign as this shore, and the sand that sifted through fingers and settled at the bottom of cups when warriors drank water that had already grown warm under the sun. This was not a camp, but rather a city where all the streets were paved with mud and weariness, where tents stood in such disorder that they might have been taken for a temporary shelter meant to stand only a few days, but which had stood for 10 years, transformed into a place where time seemed to have stopped, and with it, hope. The warriors who had once been young and full of strength had now grown old, their faces weathered by the salty wind, their beards grayed, and their eyes, once burning with a thirst for glory, now stared blankly with that emptiness that comes to people who have looked too long at the same sea, the same walls, the same faces. They ate salted fish that smelled of the sea and of time, and stale bread that crumbled in their hands, and drank water in which sand sometimes appeared, and their stomachs had grown accustomed to this food, as one grows accustomed to pain when it becomes part of life. Their swords, once as sharp as their own resolve, now rusted from the sea air, and they sharpened them again and again. But each time they looked at the walls of Troy, they understood that even the sharpest sword could not pierce stone built by the hands of gods. Some of them could no longer remember the faces of their wives. They tried to recall them, closing their eyes at night, But instead of faces, only vague outlines appeared, as if memory, like their armor, had begun to rust from long stay on this shore. They did not know what their children looked like, because their children had been infants when they left, and now they had probably become adults, and their fathers could not even imagine what they had become. They looked at the young warriors who came to replace the fallen and saw in them those they had left at home, and this thought was more bitter than any wound, because it reminded them that they had lost not only time, but also that part of life which could never be regained. The mood in the camp was tense, like a string about to snap. The warriors grumbled, and their voices, once full of confidence, now sounded hollow and irritated, like the voices of people who had grown tired of waiting and no longer knew what they wanted more, victory or simply an end. More and more voices were heard demanding either a decisive assault that might finally put an end to this endless siege, or a return home, even if that meant admitting defeat. Some of them no longer believed in victory, but they were afraid to say it aloud, because fear, like hope, was contagious, and no one wanted to be the first to admit their despair. Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief, was harsh and impatient. His face, once handsome and commanding, was now twisted by constant irritation, and his voice, when he gave orders, sounded as if he had already broken but did not want to show it. He demanded from the warriors what they could no longer give, and his anger fell upon them each time they failed to carry out his orders. And in this anger there was something of the despair of a man who knows his time is running out, but does not know how to stop it. He stood by his tent, gazing at the walls of Troy, and his thoughts were as heavy as his armor, and he thought that 10 years of war had made him not only older but also weaker, and that if Troy did not fall soon, he might lose not only his army but also himself. And yet amid this chaos, amid this weariness and despair, there was one man who did not lose hope, because his hope was not in strength but in the mind. Odysseus lay in his tent, and his sleep was heavy and restless. But even in sleep his mind continued to work, searching for a way out, searching for a way that would allow him, an ordinary mortal, to do what the gods could not. He did not know that tomorrow a thought would come to him that would change everything, a thought that would be born from the same cunning he had inherited from his grandfather Autolycus, and from the same weariness that had already begun to seep into the souls of the Trojans, making them more vulnerable to deception. He did not know that his plan had already been seen by the eyes of the one whom no one listened to, and that his victory had already been paid for by the death of a city that did not want to hear the truth. But while he slept, while his mind continued to search for the answer, the camp was quiet, and only the wind carried the smell of smoke from the Trojan side, reminding everyone that the war was not yet over. Odysseus had slept only a few hours. He woke because the rain had stopped beating on the roof of his tent, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. He sat up, leaning his back against pillows stuffed with dry grass and hay, and felt the straw prickling through the thin fabric of his chiton. Beside him, on a low wooden table, a clay lamp was burning low. The oil in it crackled, dry and short, as if someone invisible was telling beads. The flame flickered, casting long, broken shadows on the walls of the tent. They moved in time with his breathing, now contracting, now stretching, and in this movement there was something mysterious, almost ominous. Odysseus watched them and felt the cold, damp air creep under his blanket and touch his feet, felt the smell of smoke mingle with the smell of earth and rotten hay. He knew he would not be able to sleep again. Thoughts were already swarming inside him like bees in a disturbed hive, and each of them buzzed in its own way, insisting on its right to be heard. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness the walls of Troy rose before him again. They were no longer gray, they seemed black, plunged into night, like stones that had never seen the sun. 10 years. For 10 years he had looked at them, and all that time they had remained as impenetrable as on the first day. He knew it was impossible to destroy them. This was not merely knowledge, but a physical sensation he felt in every bone. The walls had been built by gods, and no battering rams, no ladders could crush them. Therefore, the task was not to destroy the walls, but to find a way to bypass them. And then he asked himself a question that sounded in his head with the same insistence with which the rain had pounded on the roof of the tent. What if the main problem is not the walls? What if the main problem is the gates? The Trojans would not open them willingly. 10 years of war had taught them that trust in the enemy was a luxury they could not afford. But what if they did not know they were opening them? What if someone opened them from the inside? He had been looking for a traitor for 10 years. For 10 years he had offered gold, promised power. He had sent spies, whispered in the ears of Trojan aristocrats, promised them life and wealth in exchange for just one key. And for 10 years they had refused. The Trojans were dying of hunger, but they did not open the gates. They saw their houses burn, but they did not surrender. Not one of them agreed to a deal that might have saved his life, but made him a traitor in the eyes of his own people. This was a dead end. Odysseus clenched his fingers into a fist, and a thought flashed through his mind. We looked for a traitor, but perhaps we were looking in the wrong place. Perhaps the traitor is the wrong path. And then, as if someone had turned a lever in his mind, he understood that the answer had been lying on the surface all along. A traitor was not needed. None of the Trojans would open the gates. But if a traitor was not needed, then who would open them? The Greeks. He had not been looking for a Trojan who would open the gates. He had been looking for a way for the Greeks themselves to get inside and open them. Why look for a traitor who would become the man who opens the gates, when you could find a way to bring your own people into the city? This was the turn that changed everything. He was not looking for a traitor. He was looking for a way to circumvent the need for one. But how to penetrate the city if the walls were impregnable and the gates were barred? He sat motionless, feeling the cold air touch his face, and his mind, accustomed to unconventional solutions, made the turn that he knew was his chief weapon. One could not enter the city, so one must make the Trojans bring them in themselves, not as enemies, but as something that, they believed, would bring them luck. Odysseus began to search for a situation in which the Trojans themselves would move the Greeks inside the walls of Troy. And then, in his head, as in a dark room in which a light suddenly flashes, an image appeared, a huge wooden structure, inside which warriors were hidden. It stands at the gates of Troy, and the Trojans themselves drag it into the city, because it looks like a gift, like atonement, like a sign that the siege is over. Not a traitor, but a temptation. Not a key, but a trap. He opened his eyes. His gaze fell upon his hands, the very hands that had once held the bow of his grandfather Autolycus, and which were now to carry this plan into execution. He did not know how to build this structure, who would be inside, how to convince Agamemnon and the other kings. But he knew that this was the right path, the only one that led to victory, because it did not require breaking down walls built by gods. It required only the cunning he had inherited from his grandfather, and which, as Autolycus had said, never runs out. And in the darkness that thickened beyond the walls of the tent, in this thick, like old honey, silence, It seemed to him that he could already feel the reality of that plan, which was to change everything. Odysseus came out of his tent, and the night met him with the same damp, salty wind that had blown from the sea for 10 years and seemed to have soaked everything around it: the canvas of the tents, the faces of the warriors, even the thoughts, which had become heavy and viscous, like sea water. He stopped at the threshold, and his eyes adjusted to the darkness, which was not absolute. Somewhere in the distance, on the walls of Troy, fires burned, and in the camp embers still glowed, and above the sea, above the horizon, stars had appeared, which, it seemed to him, looked at him with that same quiet, silent insistence with which he looked at them. He stood motionless, and his breathing was even, but his mind, like a well-oiled mechanism, continued to work, sorting through options, eliminating the impossible, approaching that one solution that was to become the key to victory. The thought that had been born in the silence of the tent had now taken shape, and he saw it clearly, as he saw the stars above his head. A horse. Enormous, majestic, made of wood, which could be passed off as a sacrificial offering. He saw it as clearly as if it already stood before him, its wooden flanks smooth and warm to the touch, its head proudly raised above the plain, its legs set wide apart, planted in the earth that had once been soaked with the blood of his friends and enemies. He knew this was madness. He knew his plan would seem ridiculous and dangerous, and that many would say it was impossible. But he also knew that this was the only way to win, because strength could not crush the walls built by the gods, and only cunning, that very cunning he had inherited from his grandfather, could do what the gods could not. He had to build a horse so enormous, so irresistible, that the Trojans could not resist the temptation. He had to make it not merely a weapon, but a symbol, a gift, an offering that would tell them, "The war is over. You have won. Accept this gift and be happy." And he knew that the Trojans, weary and exhausted by the 10-year siege, would believe this, because they wanted to believe, because hope is the strongest weakness of man, and he would give them that hope to turn it into their destruction. He did not know how long it would take to build this horse, who would be inside it, how to convince Agamemnon and the other kings that this was not madness. But he knew that he must begin, and he began to act, his steps firm and confident as he headed toward that part of the camp where lived the one who could help him carry out this plan. Odysseus waited until the camp had sunk into that heavy, almost tangible silence that comes after midnight, when even the most restless warriors stop tossing on their beds, and the breathing of the sleeping becomes even, like the tide, and only the wind, carrying the smell of the sea and the smoke of dying fires, reminds that the world has not stopped. He came out of his tent, and his steps were silent, like the steps of a man accustomed to moving in darkness without attracting attention. He knew that even in his own camp, security was an illusion, and any extraneous sound could shatter the fragile trust on which his plan depended. He walked through the sleeping camp, past tents that seemed unreal in the darkness, as if they were not part of the real world but shadows left by what once was. And his gaze swept over the faces of warriors sleeping by the fires, and he thought that if his plan failed, if the Trojans guessed, if the gods turned away from him, then these faces, those sleeping carelessly now, might be the last faces he would ever see. Hippias, by prior arrangement, was already waiting for him at his tent, located at the very edge of the camp, where the smell of resin and freshly planed would overpower even the salty sea air, and where in the darkness one could make out piles of boards, beams, and tools that Hippias had collected over 10 years, not knowing what they might be used for, but feeling that sooner or later they would be needed. He was squatting by a dying fire, and his face, rough and weathered, was illuminated by the last tongues of flame, which cast reddish, shifting shadows on his skin, making him look like a statue carved from old, dark wood. Hippias was a man of raw physical strength. His shoulders seemed to take up half the tent, and his hands, covered in scars and calluses, rested on his knees with that heavy stillness that belongs to people accustomed to long and persistent work. He was a pugilist, and his fame as the best carpenter in the Greek army was as well known as his fame as one of the strongest men in the camp. But it was precisely these hands, capable both of crushing jaws and of carving from wood something that could rival the work of the gods, that Odysseus needed on this night. Odysseus sat down opposite him, and the firelight illuminated his face, making his features sharper and his eyes deeper, as if he himself were part of that shadow gathering around them. He wasted no time on greetings, because the night was too short and the plan too important, and he began to speak, slowly, like a man who knows that every word must be weighed before it is spoken. He told him of the horse, a huge wooden structure, hollow inside, with a trapdoor that must be invisible from the outside, of how it must be built so that it would seem not merely a weapon but a sacred gift, a sacrificial horse that the Trojans would not be able to resist dragging into their city. Hippias listened, and his face, at first calm, began to change. First surprise appeared, then doubt, and then something like fear, because he, like everyone, knew that the walls of Troy were built by gods, and that any attempt to deceive them could bring down the wrath of those who were stronger than any mortal. And when Odysseus fell silent, waiting for an answer, Hippias finally spoke, and in his voice was that same heaviness with which people speak of things that elude their understanding but which they feel. "This is madness," said Hippias, and his voice was low and hoarse, like the creak of old wood. "Even if I build such a horse, how will you convince the Trojans to drag it into the city? They are not stupid, Odysseus. They have seen our tricks. They will not believe that we would simply leave them such a gift and sail away." "They will believe," Odysseus answered, and his voice was calm as the surface of water on a windless day, "because the horse is not merely wood. It is a sacrifice, and a sacrifice cannot be rejected." "They will believe," Odysseus answered, and in his voice was that confidence that comes only when you know that your plan is built not on chance, but on the very nature of human faith, because you know what the horse means to us. It is not just a weapon and not just an animal. It is a symbol of strength, speed, nobility, and at the same time, a sacred sign that connects us to Poseidon. It was he who created the first horse, striking the rock with his trident, and since then the horse has become a bridge between men and gods. The Trojans know this as well as we do. They grew up with the same stories, the same rituals. They know that to offer a horse in sacrifice is to give the gods the most precious thing you have. It is a gesture of the greatest humility and reverence. And when they see this horse at their gates, they will not be able to reject it, because for them it will not be just a piece of wood, but a sacred symbol, a sign that we acknowledge our defeat, that we are ready to atone for our sins before Athena and the other gods whom we have offended over these 10 years. Hippias was silent for a moment, gazing into the fire, and his hands, resting on his knees, clenched into fists and then unclenched, and he raised his eyes to Odysseus. "But how will you make them believe that this is a sacrifice and not a trap?" he asked, and in his voice there was not so much doubt as curiosity, the curiosity of a man who had already begun to see in this plan something more than just a mad idea. I will order you to cut down trees in the sacred grove of Apollo, so that the wood will be consecrated, said Odysseus, and his voice became quieter, as if he were speaking of something that must remain between them. On the side of the horse we will carve words addressed to Athena. We will make it too large to fit through the gates, so that they themselves will break part of the wall and thus open the way. And when they see the inscription, when they understand that this horse is atonement for our sin, for the sacrilege, for defiling her temple and stealing her sacred palladium, they will not be able not to accept it. Because if they reject it, they will bring upon themselves the wrath of the gods. If they destroy it, they will insult Athena. They have no choice, only to accept and drag it into the city. As I said, Odysseus repeated, and his voice was calm as the surface of water on a windless day. You know what the horse means to us. It is not just a weapon. This is a symbol of strength, speed, nobility, and at the same time, a sacred sign that connects us with Poseidon. The horse is not just an animal, but a bridge between the world of men and the world of gods. To offer it in sacrifice means to acknowledge one's defeat before higher powers. Therefore, the Trojans will not be able to resist when they see it at their gates. For them, it will be a gift from us, as if defeated and acknowledging our defeat to the gods. If they reject it, they will anger the gods. If they accept it, they will open the gates. This is a trap from which they have no escape, because Priam and the elders will not go against the gods. I will build the horse, said Hippias, and his voice was firmer than before. But if I build this horse, I want to be among those who enter inside. This will be my work, and I want to be there when we open the gates. Odysseus looked at him, and in his eyes was the same quiet resolve that had been in his grandfather's eyes when he sat by the fire on Parnassus and told him that cunning is not merely a skill but an art of living. He knew that Hippias was not asking for glory, not seeking honors. He was asking to be there where fate was decided, and this was more than just a request. It was a confirmation that he believed in the plan, that he was ready to die for it, that he understood it as deeply as the one who had conceived it. Agreed, he said, and they parted ways. Hippias and his assistants left the camp before dawn, when only a pale band of light was beginning to glow in the east, barely visible against the dark sky, and headed toward Mount Ida, which rose on the horizon like a dark, silent wall separating the earth from the sky. They walked along a path that wound between the hills, and their steps were heavy and measured, like the steps of men who know that their work is not merely work, but something greater, requiring not only strength, but also respect for the place where they are going. Ida was not just a mountain. It was sacred, and everyone who set foot on its slopes knew that here, in these forests where the air was saturated with the scent of pines and damp earth, events had occurred that changed the fate of the whole world. This was the very Ida where, many years ago, little Paris, the son of King Priam, abandoned by his parents because of a terrible prophecy, tended sheep, not knowing that he was a prince, and that his fate was already foreordained by the gods. Here, on these slopes, he met the nymph Oenone, who taught him to love, and here too, among these forests, 3 goddesses appeared to him, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, and he, a simple shepherd, rendered the judgment that doomed Troy to destruction. And here too, as ancient legends said, Apollo himself tended the herds of King Laomedon when he helped build the walls of Troy, and his golden hair shone in the rays of the sun as he led the animals through the green meadows. These slopes remembered the footsteps of the gods, and every stone here, every tree, every blade of grass was part of that sacred history that could not be forgotten. Hippias and his men knew that they had to cut down trees in the sacred grove of Apollo, the very grove where centuries. Meanwhile, beyond the walls of Troy, the Trojan sentries saw what was happening in the forest. They stood on the walls and watched the Greeks cutting down trees, and their faces were worried, because they knew this was not random work. They saw the forest thinning, saw clearings appearing on the slopes of Ida, and they wondered what the Greeks were planning, why they needed so much wood. It seemed strange to them that after 10 years of inaction, the Greeks had suddenly begun to so actively harvest timber, and they wondered what this could mean. A new battering ram? A siege tower? Or something else they could not imagine. Some of them, the oldest and most experienced, remembered the legends that the trees in the grove of Apollo were sacred, and that cutting them meant bringing down the wrath of the god. And they looked at the Greeks with that mixture of hope and fear that appears in people when they cannot understand what is happening. But none of them could have guessed that this would become their destruction. They saw only the forest thinning, and thought that the Greeks might be preparing for something greater, but they did not know that this something greater had already been born in the mind of Odysseus, and that the wood they were cutting would become the symbol of their own destruction. And while the Trojans watched Mount Ida, where the forest was gradually disappearing, they did not know that this disappearance was the beginning of the end, and that the one who was cutting the trees had already seen their city burning, and themselves dead or enslaved. When the last tree was felled, when Hippias and his men had finished their work, they stopped and looked at the mountain, which now looked different, as if it had lost part of its soul. They stood in silence, and the wind that blew from the sea carried to them the smell of smoke from the Trojan camp, and they knew that their work was only beginning, and that the wood they had felled must become not just wood, but a weapon that would change the course of the war. And they began the descent, carrying on their shoulders logs that were heavy as fate itself. The next day, when the sun had just begun to rise above the horizon, painting the sky in a pale pink that gradually turned to gold, Hippias and his assistants began their work. They came out onto the shore, where the waves rolled onto the sand with that same steady, soothing rhythm with which the heart of a man beats when he knows he is doing something greater than simply building with wood. The logs they had brought from Mount Ida lay on the sand, and their smell, fresh, resinous, with a slight bitterness, mingled with the smell of the sea and damp earth, creating that special aroma that exists only at dawn, when the world has not yet woken up and the air seems purer and clearer than at any other time of day. Hippias stood among them, and his eyes, accustomed to wood, already saw what was to be born from these rough, unprocessed trunks, a horse that was to become not merely a weapon but a symbol, a sign, a message that the Trojans could not ignore. The work began in silence, broken only by the sounds of axes and saws cutting into the wood with the same persistence with which time cuts into the fates of men. Hippias worked with that concentration that belongs to masters who know that every blow is not merely a movement, but part of something greater, that they are creating not just a structure, but a history that will live forever. He chose the planks, fitted them together with such precision that even the wind could not find a gap between them, and his hands, covered in scars and calluses, moved with the same confidence with which the hands of a sculptor move when he carves from stone the form that already exists in his imagination. But Hippias was not merely a sculptor. He was the heir of an ancient tradition that went back to the times when people did not yet know iron and built their ships and houses from wood, joining them with plant fibers and wooden pegs, creating structures that could stand for centuries. Hippias' mastery drew on traditions that were older than Troy itself. Centuries before the first stone was laid in the foundation of its walls, the carpenters of the Aegean world already knew how to build astonishing things from wood. Archaeologists studying Bronze Age ships have discovered that in those times there existed a whole tradition of sewn vessels, ships assembled without a single iron nail. Their planks were joined together with plant or natural fiber bindings passed through drilled holes. This was not a primitive technology but a complex art, requiring immense experience, patience, and an intuitive understanding of how wood behaves under load, how it breathes, how it ages. The carpenters knew how to saw planks from logs, smooth them so they were perfectly flat, drill holes for bindings, and hollow out grooves for tenons, using a variety of tools: axes, adzes with curved blades that allowed them to remove wood with surgical precision, and drills that rotated in their hands with the same ease with which the gears of a clockwork mechanism turn. By the time of the Trojan War, the art of carpentry had advanced far. Masters like Hippias stood on the threshold of a new era. Alongside sewing, they already possessed the mortise and tenon joint, a method that seemed almost magical in its simplicity and effectiveness. In the edge of one plank a groove was cut, and on another a tenon that fit into this groove, forming an incredibly strong joint that not only held the structure together, but also allowed the wood to breathe, move, and adapt to changes in temperature and humidity. But the most astonishing thing that archaeologists discovered in later excavations was the floating tenon. Imagine this. A tenon is a separate wooden plate that is inserted into grooves cut into both connecting parts. This method, considered a modern invention, was actually well known in ancient Greece and Rome. For additional strength, the tenons were secured with wooden wedges that were driven into holes, expanding the tenon and making the joint practically inseparable. It was precisely in this way that the planks in the hulls of ancient Greek ships were joined, ships that could ply the seas for decades without losing their strength. And now Hippias, standing on the sandy shore, used all these secrets, passed down to him by generations of carpenters and sanctified by the divine knowledge that Athena had revealed to him in a night vision. He did not simply nail planks together. He carved grooves in their edges with such precision that they seemed a natural continuation of the wood grain, and inserted floating tenons into them, which connected the parts into a single whole, as bones connect in a skeleton. He secured them with wooden wedges, which he drove in with the same force with which a blacksmith drives a wedge into a crack in a rock, knowing that on this blow depended whether the structure would hold or fall apart. He made stiffening ribs, like those of a ship, so that the horse would not fall apart when it was dragged over stones, and so that it could withstand the blow of a spear if one of the Trojans suspected something and tried to test its strength. Every movement of his was an act of the highest mastery, standing on the shoulders of generations of carpenters who passed their knowledge from mouth to mouth, from father to son, from master to apprentice. On the very first night, when Hippias had already begun to lose hope that he could finish the work on time, Athena herself appeared to him, the goddess of wisdom and crafts, the patroness of Odysseus and of those who act not by force but by the mind. She came to him in a dream, and her voice was like the rustle of wind in the leaves, heard only by those who know how to listen. She stood before him, her eyes shining with the same light as the stars above the camp, and she said to him, "I will teach you to build the horse, because this horse must be not merely a wooden object. It must be perfect as my wisdom and irresistible as my will." And she showed him how to join the planks so that they would hold forever, how to carve the details so that they would seem alive, and how to make a trapdoor that would be invisible even to the most attentive eye. And when Hippias woke, he knew that his work was not merely work, but part of a divine plan that was to change the course of the war. 3 days and 3 nights the masters worked without stopping, and their bodies grew tired, but their spirit remained unbroken, because they knew that their work was not mere construction, but the creation of a symbol that would live for centuries. They did not sleep, did not eat, did not rest, and only when the sun set and the first stars appeared in the sky did they allow themselves to pause for a moment and look at what they had created. And the horse grew, huge, smooth, with its head proudly raised, its flanks smooth and warm to the touch, its legs set wide apart, as if it were ready to take a step forward, and its eyes, carved from dark wood, looked out at the sea, as if waiting for the moment when they would see Troy from the inside. When the work was completed, when the last plank was fitted, when the last detail was carved, Hippias and his assistant stopped and looked at the horse that stood on the shore, and in its grandeur there was something that made the heart beat faster. On its side was carved the inscription that Odysseus had dictated to them. The departing Danaans offer this gift to Athena the warrior. The words were carved deeply and clearly, so that the Trojans could read them from a distance. And in them was that confidence that comes only when you know that your plan is not merely a plan, but part of a destiny that must be fulfilled. And at that time in the Greek camp, the warriors stood around the horse and looked at it with that mixture of surprise and fear that appears in people when they see something they cannot understand. They had seen the horse grow, seen it become larger and larger, and they did not know what it was for. Some of them guessed that it was part of Odysseus's plan, but no one knew exactly what was hidden inside this wooden colossus. And this secret was the same secret that was to become the key to victory. They stood and looked at the horse, and the wind that blew from the sea carried to them the smell of freshly planed wood. And they knew that this smell would be the last smell of Troy they would feel before everything ended. When the horse was ready, Odysseus stood before it and thought that now there remained only the last, most important step, to choose those who were to go inside. He knew that this would be not merely a choice, but a sentence, and that those he chose might never emerge from this wooden prison. But he also knew that without them the plan would fail, and that if they failed, Troy would remain standing, and the war would last another 10 years or more. He began with those who had been with him from the very beginning. Menelaus, whose wife had become the cause of the war, whose honor had been insulted and whose life had been destroyed by that very act that had brought them to these walls, stood first on the list, and his face, when he heard his name, was calm, like the face of a man who had long ago decided that he must be where his fate was decided. He did not say a word, did not ask a single question, merely nodded, and this gesture was more eloquent than any words, because it meant that he was ready to die to win back his wife, even if she was no longer the wife he had once known. Diomedes, the youngest of the kings, but already famed for his courage, did not hesitate for a moment. His eyes, which had seen so many battles that they seemed to have ceased to be surprised by anything, kindled with the same fire that had burned in them when he first set foot on Trojan soil. He was one of those who was always ready to go forward, and for him this was not a choice, but a continuation of the path he had chosen for himself many years before. Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, stood among them like the ghost of his father, and his face was as young and as resolute as his father's face had been when he first set foot on Trojan soil. He did not know his father as he would have wished, but he knew that his blood was the same blood that had flowed in the veins of the greatest warrior of Greece, and that he must be worthy of that legacy. Ajax the Lesser, unlike his great namesake, was not the strongest or the loudest, but he was swift and cunning, and his smile when he heard his name was the same smile that had been on his face when he first saw the walls of Troy, a smile of a man who knows he is doing what he must. But the list did not end with the great names. In it were those who were not kings, not heroes, not famed warriors, those who had simply been there, who had fought, who had waited, who had believed that the war would one day end. He chose them not for their glory, but for their loyalty, for their courage, for their readiness to die for what they believed in. In all there were 30 of them, 30 men who were to enter this wooden womb and wait until that very hour when they would open the gates and let death into the city that had been their enemy for 10 years. They gathered by the horse, and their faces were serious, like the faces of men who know that this is their last chance, and that if they do not do this now, they will never return home. The wind that blew from the sea carried to them the smell of smoke from the Trojan camp, and they looked at the walls that stood before them, and knew that beyond these walls awaited not only their enemies, but also their own fate. Odysseus stood before them, and his voice was calm as the surface of water on a windless day, when he spoke to them of what they must do, of what awaited them inside, of what awaited them outside when they emerged from the horse. He did not promise them victory, did not promise them glory, did not promise them a return home. He only told them that this was their chance, and that if they agreed, they would enter history as those who changed the course of the war. And they agreed, because they were warriors, and because they knew that this was their only way to return home. The night they had awaited from the very moment the last plank was fitted to the horse's flank finally descended upon the camp. Heavy, moonless, and windy, the kind of night needed for a deed that cannot bear prying eyes or unnecessary sounds. The Greeks who were to remain outside had already begun to burn their tents and prepare the ships for departure, and their voices, mingled with the crackling of fire and the creak of oars, reached the horse like distant noise that gradually faded, receding into the darkness. And inside, in that darkness which was thicker and more impenetrable than the night outside, several dozen warriors awaited their hour, and each of them, gripping their weapons, wrestled with that nameless fear that lives in every man when he stands on the threshold of the unknown. They approached the horse one by one, and their steps were silent, like the steps of shadows that glide across the earth leaving no trace. The rope ladder attached to the horse's flank was their only entrance, and they climbed it as one climbs a ladder leading into the unknown, slowly, carefully, feeling with their fingers the rough surface of the ropes that might break, and the smooth planks that might not bear their weight. Inside the horse it was dark, so dark that they could not see their hands, and the air was heavy and stale, saturated with the smell of freshly planed wood and resin that had not yet dried, and this smell mingled with the smell of their own sweat, and the fear they did not show but felt as clearly as they felt the beating of their own hearts. Each of them, as they entered, experienced their own moment of silence, their own conversation with themselves, their own moment of overcoming. Menelaus, whose wife had become the cause of this war, whose honor had been insulted and whose life had been destroyed by that very act that had brought them to these walls, went first. His face, as he climbed the ladder, was calm, like the face of a man who had long ago decided that he must be where his fate was decided, but within him a storm raged. He thought of Helen, of the woman he had loved and lost, and that if he did not return, she would remain in this city that was destined to fall, and he did not know whether that would be salvation or punishment for her. He sat on the bench, and his hands gripped his sword, and he closed his eyes, because in the darkness there was nothing to see, and he wanted only to hear the beating of his heart, which reminded him that he was still alive. Diomedes, the youngest of the kings but already famed for his courage, went second. His eyes, which had seen so many battles that they seemed to have ceased to be surprised by anything, kindled with the same fire that had burned in them when he first set foot on Trojan soil. But now in that fire there was something new, a shadow of doubt that appears in people when they first encounter something they cannot control. He sat on the bench, and his hands gripped his spear, and he thought of his wife, who waited for him in Argos, and of his children, who had probably already grown up and no longer remembered his face. He knew that he must return, but he also knew that this might be his last battle, and this thought was heavier than any armor he had ever worn. Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, stood among them like the ghost of his father, and his face was as young and as resolute as his father's face had been when he first set foot on Trojan soil. He did not know his father as he would have wished, but he knew that his blood was the same blood that had flowed in the veins of the greatest warrior of Greece, and that he must be worthy of that legacy. He sat on the bench, and his hands gripped the bow he had inherited from his father, and he thought that his father had died beneath the walls of this city, and that he too might die here, and that this would not be an end but a continuation of the same story that had begun many years before. Ajax the Lesser, unlike his great namesake, was not the strongest or the loudest, but he was swift and cunning, and his smile when he climbed the ladder was the same smile that had been on his face when he first saw the walls of Troy, a smile of a man who knows he is doing what he must. He sat on the bench, and his hands gripped his sword, and he thought of his brother, who had died beneath the walls of this city, and that he too might die here, and that this would not be defeat but victory, because he would die for what he believed in. But the list did not end with the great names. In it were those who were not kings, not heroes, not famed warriors, those who had simply been there, who had fought, who had waited, who had believed that the war would one day end. They sat in the darkness, and each of them wrestled with their fear, with that nameless fear that lives in every man when he stands on the threshold of the unknown. Some of them, the youngest and most inexperienced, tried to remember the faces of their wives and children, but in the darkness those faces seemed as distant as the stars they could no longer see. Others, the oldest and most experienced, closed their eyes and imagined the battlefield where they had fought many years before, and this helped them forget that they were now in this wooden prison. Odysseus entered last. He stood at the entrance, and his hand touched the wooden flank of the horse, which was smooth and warm to the touch, as if it were alive. He looked at the camp, which was already burning, and at the ships, which were already setting sail, and at the walls of Troy, which stood on the horizon, and at the stars, which were lighting up one by one in the dark sky, and he knew that this was his last look at the world he knew. He climbed the ladder, and his movements were as silent as those who had entered before him, and when he was inside, he turned and closed the trapdoor behind him. And in that moment, when the trapdoor closed with a dull thud, he felt the fear he had held at bay for so long touch his heart for an instant, and he allowed himself to feel it. because he knew that fear was not weakness but part of what makes a man human. Inside it was quiet, so quiet that when the wind blew from the sea, it carried to them the voices of the Greeks who were already sailing away, and the crackling of the fire devouring their camp, and the sound of oars cutting through the water. They sat in the darkness, and their hands gripped their weapons, and their eyes, accustomed to the darkness, began to distinguish each other's outlines, and they waited. It seemed to them that they waited an eternity, though in reality only a few hours had passed, and their bodies, which had been so tense when they entered, began to relax, and their thoughts, which had been so focused on what was to come, began to drift back to the times when they were young, when the war had not yet begun, when they had homes and wives, and children they did not yet know. When the last Greek ship had disappeared beyond the horizon, when the smoke from the burned camp had begun to dissipate, rising to the sky in thin, almost weightless wisps, and when on the empty shore only the horse remained, huge and motionless. On this empty shore there remained only one man, Sinon, the cousin of Odysseus, the son of Esimus, the grandson of Autolycus. He stood at the very edge of the water, dirty and exhausted, his clothes torn, his body covered with scratches he had inflicted on himself the day before to make his story more convincing. He stood motionless, and his breathing was even, but his heart beat faster than usual, because he knew that everything depended on him, that his role in this plan was no less important than that of those who already sat inside the horse, and that if he made a mistake, if the Trojans did not believe him, then all their sacrifices would have been in vain. Sinon was not a legendary warrior, not a hero, not one of those whose names would live for centuries. He was merely a man who had inherited from his grandfather Autolycus the same cunning that flowed in the blood of Odysseus, and who knew that his chief weapon was not a sword but words. He stood on this empty shore and waited for the Trojans to notice him, for them to come out of the city and find him there by the horse, and when he began to speak, he must convince them that his lie was the truth. He knew that this lie must be flawless, that every word must be weighed, and that if they suspected him, he would die, and with him would die their last hope of victory. The wind blew from the sea, and it carried to Sinon the smell of water and sand, and this smell, which he had known since childhood, reminded him that his home was far away, beyond this sea, and that if he did not return, no one would wait for him. He thought of his mother, who had remained in Ithaca, and of his father Esimus, who, like his grandfather Autolycus, lived in Thessaly and waited for news that the war was over. He thought that perhaps they would never know what had become of him, and that his body, if he died here, would lie on this shore where no one would find him. But he pushed these thoughts away, because they were dangerous, because they could weaken his resolve, and because he knew that his lie must be strong, so that it could convince those who stood behind the walls of Troy. He heard how, somewhere in the distance, beyond the city walls, lights began to appear, and how the voices of the Trojans, still sleepy but already full of curiosity, began to spread through the streets. He knew that soon they would come out of the city, that they would see the empty shore and the horse, and that they would find him there, at the foot of this wooden monster, and that he must be ready for this meeting. He dropped to his knees and began deliberately working himself up to tears. And when he raised his eyes, he saw the gates of Troy beginning to open, and the first Trojans, cautious and distrustful, beginning to emerge onto the plain to see what remained of the Greek camp. And he knew that his moment had come. He rose to his feet, brushed the sand and dirt from himself, and began to move slowly, like a man who can barely stand, toward the horse, pretending that he did not notice them, that he simply wanted to shelter from the wind and the shadow of this wooden monster. He knew that they would see him, that they would approach him, and that he must tell them his story in such a way that they would believe him. And when he heard their footsteps behind him, when he felt their breath on his neck, he began to speak, slowly, quietly, like a man who has already ceased to hope for anything but death. Sinon knew that the Trojans did not come out of the city immediately. First they stood on the walls, peering into the darkness where the fires of the Greek camp had recently burned, and their faces, as they looked at the empty shore, were full of that mixture of distrust and hope that appears in people who have lived too long in expectation of the end. They saw the smoke from the burned tents rising to the sky, and the ships that had once stood at anchor disappearing beyond the horizon, and on the sand only the horse remained, huge and motionless, as if it had always been there, as part of this shore, as part of their fate. They looked at it, and in their eyes was that same surprise that appears in people when they see something they cannot understand. When at last they came out onto the plain, when their feet stepped onto the sand that still held the warmth of the burned camp, they saw him, a man sitting at the foot of the horse, dirty and exhausted, his face pale as the face of a man who had already ceased to hope for anything but death. They approached him, and their steps were cautious, like the steps of people who do not know what awaits them. "I am Sinon," he said, and his voice was hoarse, like the voice of a man who had not drunk for several days. "I was one of them, but they cast me out. They wanted to sacrifice me to the gods, to ensure their safe return home. Odysseus, the one you know as the craftiest of the Greeks, convinced them that my blood was needed by the gods so that they would have mercy on them. I escaped when they were already preparing for the sacrifice. I hid in the shadow of this horse and waited for them to sail away. And now I am here before you, and I will tell you everything I know." He paused, and his eyes, which were as empty as the sky above him, met the eyes of the Trojans, and he saw in them that same fear and that same hope that had been in his own eyes when he waited for them on this shore. He knew that his lie must be flawless, that every word must be weighed, and that if they suspected him, he would die, and with him would die their last hope of victory. "The horse," he continued, and his voice became quieter, as if he feared that the gods would hear him. "This horse is a gift to Athena. The Greeks built it to appease the goddess whom they offended when they defiled her temple and stole her sacred palladium. They left it here so that you, the Trojans, could accept it as a gift to your altar of Athena, as a sign that the war is over and that the gods favor you. If you drag it into the city, you will become invincible. If you destroy it, Athena will punish you, and her wrath will be more terrible than any wrath you have ever seen." He fell silent, and his eyes, which were as empty as the sky above him, met the eyes of the Trojans, and he saw in them what he wanted to see, belief. They listened to him with greedy attention, and their faces, which only moments before had been full of doubt, began to change, and in them appeared the same hope that had been in his own eyes when he waited for them on this shore. They wanted to believe, because they were weary, because they had waited too long, because they wanted the war to finally end, and because they wanted to return to their normal lives. They stood around him, and their voices, when they began to speak, were full of that same hope that was in their eyes. They spoke of how they must drag the horse into the city to appease Athena and ensure their safety. And when they began to pull the horse toward the gates, when their hands touched its wooden flanks, Sinon stood apart and watched them, and his face was calm, like the face of a man who knows he has done what he must. And then, from the crowd, a man ran out whose face was pale as the face of one who sees what others do not see. This was Laocoon, the priest of Apollo, the very one who served the god of prophecy and who should have known that the gift of the gods is never what it appears to be. He rushed toward the crowd, and his voice, when he cried out, was full of that same horror that was in his eyes, and which made his heart beat faster than the heart of any of those who stood around him. "Fear the Greeks, even when they bring gifts," he shouted, and his voice was so loud that it seemed even the gods on Olympus must have heard him. "Do not believe this gift. Do not drag it into the city. Inside it is death, and if you open the gates to it, you will open the gates to your own destruction." He seized a spear that lay on the ground and hurled it into the wooden flank of the horse. The spear pierced the wood, and from within came a hollow, metallic sound, a sound like the striking of emptiness, a sound that could only be made by an empty object, or perhaps by an object in which men were hidden. Laocoon froze, listening to this sound, and his face, which had already been pale, grew even paler, because he understood that this sound was confirmation of his fears, that inside the horse there was indeed something that should not be there. But the Trojans who stood around him did not hear this sound, or did not wish to hear it. They looked at him with that mixture of fear and distrust that appears in people when they see one who tells them the truth, but they do not wish to believe that truth. They stood motionless, and their faces, which only moments before had been full of hope, were now full of doubt, because they did not know whom to believe, the priest who served Apollo, or one who was their enemy. And then, when they had already begun to waver, when they had already begun to doubt that the horse was a gift from the gods, from the sea there emerged 2 giant serpents. They were enormous, their bodies so thick that they seemed able to encircle a man, and their scales glittered in the light of the torches like polished bronze. They moved silently, like shadows, and their eyes, when they looked at the crowd, were as empty as the eyes of death. They did not attack the Trojans. They did not touch any of those who stood around the horse. They made straight for Laocoon and his sons, who stood beside him. These serpents were sent by Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, who from the very beginning had favored the Greeks and was angry with Troy because Paris had once preferred Aphrodite to her, and because the Trojans had defiled her sanctuary. Unlike Aphrodite, who was on the side of the Trojans and poured ambrosia upon her heroes, that very divine food that grants immortality and otherworldly strength, and saved Paris from death, Athena was merciless to those who stood in her path. She saw in Laocoon an obstacle to her plan, and she decided to remove him in such a way that it would appear as divine punishment. The serpents coiled around the bodies of Laocoon and his sons, and their rings, cold and strong, tightened around them, and they fell to the ground, their eyes still open, but in them there was no longer life. Their death was not accidental, but part of a divine design in which the fate of Troy was already sealed. The Trojans stood around them, and their faces, which only moments before had been full of doubt, were now full of horror, but a horror mixed with relief, because they did not know whether this was punishment for the priest having insulted the sacred gift or confirmation of his words. They stood motionless, and their voices, when they began to speak, were full of that same hope that had been in their eyes when they first saw the horse. They spoke of how Laocoon had been punished for insulting the god, for daring to raise his hand against a sacred gift, and that now that he was dead, they must do what he had forbidden them to do. drag the horse into the city, and offer it as a sacrifice to Athena. And they continued to pull the horse toward the gates, and none of them looked back at the bodies of Laocoon and his sons, which lay on the sand, forgotten and unwanted by anyone. And at that time, somewhere high above, in that very stone tower which her father had ordered locked so that she would not disturb the people with her dark prophecies, Cassandra stood at the grating and watched what was happening below. Her face, pale and motionless, was illuminated by the light of the torches which the Trojans carried as they dragged the horse toward the gates. And in this light her features seemed even sharper, even more pained, as if she herself felt every blow which the wooden wheels of the horse dealt to the stones of the pavement. She saw them laughing, saw them singing, saw their faces, weary and exhausted by the 10-year war, finally illuminated by that hope which she so feared, because she knew that this hope was false, that it was that very trap into which they were destined to fall. She saw them dragging the horse, and in her chest a cry rose, that very cry which she had held back for so long, because she knew that no one would hear it. She saw them pass by the house of Antenor, where the Greek envoys had once stayed, and how they did not notice that their own fate had already been decided, that they themselves, with their own hands, were opening the gates to their destruction. And when they began to drag the horse into the city, when its wooden flanks, smooth and warm, slid through the gates, she could not bear it and screamed. "Stop!" she cried, and her voice, when it echoed through the empty corridors of the tower, was as empty as her hope. "It is a trap. Inside it are Greeks hiding. They are waiting for you to fall asleep, so that they can come out and open the gates. You must not drag it into the city." But her voice drowned in the noise of the celebration that had already begun to spread through the streets of Troy. People sang, danced, drank wine, and their laughter, loud and carefree, drowned out her cries, as the noise of the surf drowns out the cry of a lone seagull. She beat against the grating of her prison, her hands gripping the cold iron bars, and her face, which had been so pale, was now red with exertion, but she could not break through that wall of indifference that stood between her and those who should have heard her. "Do not drag it in," she cried again and again, and her voice grew hoarser, more desperate, but no one heard her. She knew that this was her curse, to know the truth and to be powerless, to see the future and to have no power to change it. The horse proved too large for the gates. This was that very detail which Odysseus had foreseen with the same meticulousness with which his grandfather Autolycus had once calculated his thefts. The horse had to be too large to pass through the gates, so that the Trojans, blinded by joy and impatience, would themselves decide to tear down part of the wall to let it in. And they did so. They did not hesitate, did not consult the seers, did not remember the warnings of Laocoon, which had already begun to fade from their memory, as traces fade in the sand when the tide comes in. They simply seized their tools and began to dismantle the wall, that very wall which the gods had once built, which battering rams could not breach and ladders could not overcome, and their hands, accustomed to weapons, now gripped picks and crowbars, and they worked with that same feverish energy with which people work when they know that their victory is already near. Stones fell, dust rose to the sky, and in this dust, mingled with smoke and the smell of the sea, there was something that recalled that this was not merely a wall but a boundary between past and future, between life and death. When the passage was wide enough, when the last stone fell to the ground, they began to pull the horse inside. Their hands, which had once held swords and shields, now touched its wooden flanks, smooth and warm to the touch, and they pushed it with the same force with which they push a ship when it is preparing to set sail. The horse moved slowly, its wooden legs scraping against the stones, and in this sound there was something that made hearts beat faster, because it was the sound of victory, the sound of the end of the war, the sound that they could finally return to their normal lives. They dragged it through the streets of Troy, and their voices, when they sang and shouted, were as loud as their hope. Children ran alongside, their small hands touching its wooden flanks, and their faces, when they looked at this monster, were full of that same wonder that appears in children when they see something they cannot understand but which seems beautiful to them. They touched it, and their fingers slid across the smooth surface, and they laughed, because they did not know that their laughter was the last, that their games were the last, that their lives were the last. Women threw flowers, and their petals, pink and white, fell upon the wooden flanks of the horse, like tears which they did not know they had already begun to shed. They stood at windows and doors, and their faces, when they looked at the horse, were as bright as the stars that had already begun to light up one by one in the dark sky. When the horse was finally set up in the square before the palace of Priam, when its wooden legs, set wide apart, touched the stone slabs, and when its head, proudly raised, looked upon the city that had just accepted it as its savior, the Trojans stopped and looked at it. They stood around it, and their faces, when they looked at this wooden monster, were as calm as the faces of people who know that their struggle is over. They did not know that their struggle was only beginning, that their victory was their defeat, and that their happiness was their destruction. The horse's head, proudly raised, looked upon the city that had just accepted it as its savior, and through the streets of Troy a wave of exultation continued to roll, as warm and intoxicating as the wine that had already begun to be poured into cups. The faces of the Trojans, still pale and weary only recently, now shone with that joy that appears in people when they can finally breathe freely, when the weight of 10 years of war falls from their shoulders, as a heavy cloak falls from one who has worn it too long. The doors of houses swung wide open, and from them emerged families who had forgotten what it was like to go out into the street without fear, without glancing at the walls, and without listening for the sound of trumpets. The youngest Trojans, those who had been born during the siege and had never known peace, ran through the streets with torches in their hands, and their laughter, bright and carefree, echoed through the alleyways, mingling with the smell of roasted meat and the smoke that rose from the fires kindled right in the squares. They danced around the fires, their shadows flickering on the walls of the houses, and their faces, when they looked at the flames, were as bright as their hope. The old men, who could no longer dance, sat by the gates, and their eyes, when they looked at the children, were full of that same joy that had been in their hearts when they themselves were young. The women, who had worried for their husbands for so many years, stood at the doors, and their hands, when they embraced their loved ones, trembled with that same joy that was in their hearts, and the tears that flowed down their cheeks were tears of happiness, not of grief. On the main square before the palace of Priam, where silence and tension had reigned only recently, a feast was now in progress. The tables were laden with delicacies, roasted meat, fresh bread, cheese, olives, and wine flowed like a river, and its dark red color, as it was poured into cups, seemed as warm as the fire that burned in the hearts of the Trojans. The men who had fought for so many years on the walls and in the fields now sat at the tables, and their hands, accustomed to swords and spears, gripped cups, and their voices, when they raised toasts, were full of that same confidence that appears in people when they know that their struggle is over. They spoke of how the war had finally ended, how they could return to their families, to their fields, to their homes, and that no one else would die beneath the walls of this city. Musicians played lyres and flutes, and their melodies, as they spread across the square, were as light as the wind that had already begun to die down, as if it too wanted to join this celebration. Young warriors, who had known only war all their lives, now drank wine and laughed, and their laughter, loud and carefree, echoed through the city, mingling with the smell of smoke and roasted meat. They did not think that their celebration was the last, that their laughter was the last, that their songs were the last. They did not know that inside the horse that stood on the square before the palace, those who were to open the gates and let death into their homes were waiting. They simply drank, danced, laughed, because they were weary, because they had waited too long, because they wanted to forget all those years they had spent in fear and tension. Inside the horse it was dark and quiet. The warriors sat motionless, gripping their weapons, and their breathing, steady and almost soundless, was the only sound that broke the silence. They heard from outside, beyond the wooden walls of their refuge, the voices of the Trojans, their laughter, their songs, their drunken cries that echoed through the city as if they were part of that very celebration which they could not share. Each minute spent in this darkness lasted an eternity, and their bodies, which had been so tense when they entered, were now beginning to tire from this waiting, from this inaction, from this feeling that they were at the center of events but could not take part in them. And it was precisely at this moment, when they had already come to believe that their plan would work, when they had already ceased to doubt that everything was proceeding according to Odysseus's design, that they heard a voice as piercing as the cry of a bird, and as desperate as the cry of one who knows that she will not be heard. It was the voice of the prophetess Cassandra. She had somehow escaped from her tower. Apparently, in the chaos of the celebration, the servants assigned to her by King Priam had forgotten to lock the door, and her long dark hair streamed in the wind, and her face, pale and contorted with horror as she ran through the streets of Troy, was as empty as her hope. She ran toward the horse and screamed. "Inside it are Greeks," she cried. "It is a trap. They are waiting for you to fall asleep, so that they can come out and open the gates. You must burn it. You must destroy it." But her voice drowned in the noise of the celebration, and the crowd, intoxicated with the joy of victory, paid her no attention. They laughed at her. They waved her away. They told her she was mad, that she did not know what she was saying, that her prophecies were merely the fruit of her sick imagination. And when she realized that words would not help, when she saw that her voice could not break through that wall of indifference, she decided to act. She seized an axe that lay by one of the fires and raised a burning torch, and her eyes, when she looked at the horse, burned with the same fire that burned in the torch she held in her hand. She ran toward the horse, and her steps were as fast as her heartbeat, and she knew that this was her only chance to save the city she loved more than anything in the world. Inside the horse, the warriors heard her footsteps and pressed themselves to the thin cracks between the planks. They saw her approaching, and their bodies tensed, and their hands, gripping their weapons, clenched even tighter, because they knew that if she struck the horse with the axe, if she set it alight with her torch, their plan would fail, and they would burn alive together with this wooden monster. They heard her breathing, which was as ragged as their own, and they heard her voice, still crying out that they were hiding inside. They could not see her clearly, for the horse had been crafted masterfully and the cracks were small. But the warriors knew that she was already standing right at the horse's flank, and that if she struck, if she set it alight, they would not even have time to escape. And then, when Cassandra had already raised the axe, when she was already about to deliver that blow which was to destroy the horse and save her city, the Trojans who were watching her seized her. Their hands, rough and strong, tore the axe and torch from her, and they dragged her away from the horse, and their voices, when they shouted at her, were as loud as her own, but in them was a confidence that was not in her voice. They told her to return to her tower, not to disturb their celebration, to leave them alone with her dark prophecies. She tried to resist, tried to break free, tried to scream, but her voice was already beginning to fade, because she knew that her fate was predetermined, that her curse was inevitable, and that she could not save the city that was already doomed. They took her by the arms on both sides and led her back to the tower. And then the moment came, when the last voices had fallen silent in the streets of Troy, when the last lights had gone out in the windows, and when that deep, almost tangible darkness had descended upon the city, the kind that comes only before dawn, when even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sinan, who had been waiting all this time in the shadow of the city wall, began to act. He moved silently, like a shadow, his steps as light as the steps of a man accustomed to hiding in the darkness, and his eyes, accustomed to the night, were as sharp as those of a predator who knows that his time has come. He approached the horse, and his hand touched its wooden flank, smooth and warm to the touch, as if it were alive, and he felt his heart beat faster, because he knew that everything depended on him, that his role in this plan was no less important than that of those who were already waiting inside, and that if he made a mistake, if the signal was seen too late or too early, all their sacrifices would have been in vain. He pulled from his belt the torch he had prepared in advance, and his hands, as he lit it, trembled, but not from fear, rather from that cold, almost icy excitement that appears in people when they know that their action is not merely an action, but part of something greater, part of a destiny that must be fulfilled. When the torch caught fire, its light, red and flickering, illuminated his face, and he raised it high above his head and began to wave it toward the sea, toward the place beyond the horizon, where the Greek fleet waited at the island of Tenedos. He waved it slowly, rhythmically, like a man who knows that his signal will be seen, and his movements, as he repeated them again and again, were as precise as the movements of a clockwork mechanism. And at that time, somewhere beyond the horizon, at the island of Tenedos, the Greeks who had been waiting for this signal for several hours finally saw it. They stood on the decks of their ships, and their faces, when they looked at the distant shore where the red light flickered, were as tense as the faces of men who know that their time has come. They began to row, and their oars, as they entered the water, were as silent as Sinan's steps, and their ships, as they moved toward the shore, were as dark as the night that surrounded them. The wind that blew from the sea was as quiet as the breath of the sleeping city, and only the sound of the oars cutting through the water broke the silence. Inside the horse, the warriors heard the signal knock. It was the sound they had been waiting for from the very moment they had entered this wooden womb, and when they heard it, their bodies, which had been so tense, relaxed, and their faces, which had been so focused, lit up with that quiet, almost imperceptible smile that appears in people when they know that their time has come. They began to prepare, and their movements, as they checked their weapons, as they adjusted their armor, as they took their places by the trapdoor, were as silent as the movements of men who know that their success depends on how unnoticed they remain. They knew that their hour had come, and that in a few minutes they would emerge from this darkness and begin to do what they were meant to do. And somewhere in the city, in that very tower where the one whom no one listened to sat, Cassandra looked into the darkness and knew that her premonitions were coming true. She heard, somewhere in the distance, beyond the city walls, the sound of oars at work. The trapdoor of the horse opened without a sound. Hippias, who had built it himself and knew every hinge, every wooden joint, silently slid it aside, and through the opening rushed fresh night air, mingled with the smell of smoke still rising over the city. Odysseus stood at the entrance, and his hand, when he touched the edge of the trapdoor, was steady and calm, like the hand of a man who knows that his time has come. He dropped the rope ladder and took a step forward and began to descend, slowly, carefully, his toes protruding from his sandals sliding down the rough ropes. Behind him, one by one, the other warriors descended. Their steps were silent, like the steps of shadows gliding across the earth leaving no trace, and their breathing, when they stepped onto the ground, was as quiet as the breathing of the sleeping city. They were ready, their weapons were at hand, and their eyes, accustomed to the darkness, were already beginning to make out the outlines of the streets through which they had to pass. They knew that their success depended on how unnoticed they remained, and they moved with the same caution with which predators move when they stalk their prey. They divided into groups, each of which was to carry out its task, to kill the guards at the gates, to suppress any resistance that might arise, and to prepare the way for the main army, which was already approaching the city. Odysseus walked at the front. They moved through the empty streets, and their steps, as they trod upon the stone slabs, were as quiet as the breathing of the sleeping city. They met no resistance, only silence, which was deeper than any silence they had ever known, and only shadows, which moved with them. They passed by houses where the Trojans slept, and their breathing, as they passed by the windows, was as even as the breathing of those who slept inside. They passed by the square where the Trojans had feasted only recently, and where now only the embers of the fires still glowed, and the smell of wine and roasted meat still hung in the air, mingling with the smell of the night and the sea. When they reached the gates, when they saw the guards standing at their posts, their faces were as calm as the faces of men who do not know that their death is near. Odysseus gave the signal, and his men, who moved with the same silence with which shadows move, surrounded the guards, and their swords, when they struck, were as swift as lightning, and their blows were as precise as the blows of a hammer on an anvil. The guards fell, and their bodies, when they touched the ground, were as motionless as the stones on which they had stood. Odysseus approached the gates and began to push them. The gates began to open, slowly, with a creak that in the silence of the night seemed as loud as a scream, and when they had opened wide enough for an army to pass through, he stopped and looked into the darkness. Now it was either victory or death. Through the opening, like water bursting through a dam, the Greek army poured in, the army that had waited for this moment for 10 years. They did not shout, did not sing battle songs, did not sound trumpets. They simply ran, and their steps, as they trod upon the soil of Troy, were as heavy as their breathing, and as swift as their hearts, which beat in unison with the rhythm set by fate itself. They ran, and their faces, as they burst into the city, were as dark as the night that surrounded them, and as bright as the fire they carried in their hands. At first it was merely noise, the sound of footsteps, the sound of breathing, the sound of metal clanging with every movement. But in an instant, that noise transformed into something more, into cries, into groans, into the sound of blows falling upon bodies that could not defend themselves. The Greeks broke into the houses, and their swords, as they plunged into the bodies of sleeping Trojans, were as swift as lightning, and their blows were as precise as the blows of a hammer on an anvil. They killed everyone who crossed their path. The streets, which only recently had been full of celebrating Trojans, were now drenched in blood. Houses burned, and their flames, as they rose to the sky, were as bright as the sun that had not yet risen. The Greeks hurled burning torches onto the houses, and they caught fire, and their crackling, as they burned, was as loud as the cries of those who ran out of them. In this chaos, in this noise, in this madness that seized the city, there was something that made the heart clench with pain, because this was the end, and this was an end that could not be avoided. Troy, which had held out against the siege for 10 years, fell in a single night. Its walls, which the gods had once built, its gates, which had once protected its inhabitants, its streets, which had once been full of life, all of it vanished in flame and smoke, leaving behind only ash and emptiness. And in this end, in this final act that was to complete the story, there was something that made it inevitable as the sunset that comes after every day, and as inevitable as the death that comes after every life. And when the first rays of the sun began to appear above the horizon, when the night began to yield to morning, when the last cries had fallen silent in the city, and when the last fires had gone out in the windows, Troy lay in ruins, and its inhabitants, those who had survived, stood on the ashes and looked at what remained of their city. They knew that their lives would never be the same, that they had lost everything they had, and that the only thing left to them was the memory that once they had been part of a great city that had fallen because of its own pride. Priam, the last king of Troy, sat at the altar of Zeus in his palace. He was old, so old that his hands, when he rested them on his knees, trembled, and his eyes, when he looked at the fire that had already begun to creep toward the walls of his home, were as empty as the faces of those who had already died. He heard the cries that came from the streets, and the smell of smoke that penetrated his lungs, and he knew that his city had fallen, that his sons were dead, that his people, whom he had ruled for so many years, were now scattering through the streets, trying to save their lives. He did not try to flee. He did not try to save himself. He simply sat at the altar, and his lips, when he whispered prayers, were as dry as his eyes, which could no longer weep. He prayed to Zeus, that very god who had once helped build the walls of his city, and asked him for protection, for mercy, for his death to be swift and painless. He knew that his time had come, that his fate was predetermined, and that he could not escape what was meant to happen. He thought of his sons, of Hector, who had died defending his city, of Paris, who had died from a poisoned arrow, of all those who had already departed, and that he, their father, remained here to meet his end alone. And when he heard footsteps approaching him, when he saw a shadow appear in the doorway, he did not raise his head, because he knew who it was. It was Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, that very warrior who had inherited from his father not only his strength, but also his hatred for Troy. He stood in the doorway, and his face, when he looked at the old king, was as cold as the steel of his sword, and his eyes, when they met the eyes of Priam, were as empty as the eyes of a man who knows that his mission is almost complete. Neoptolemus approached him and raised his sword. Priam did not even have time to cry out when his body fell upon the stones, because his death was as swift as his life had been long. The dynasty that had ruled Troy for centuries ended on this night. And when morning finally rose over the city, when the first rays of the sun illuminated its ruins, no one came to mourn the old king. The city continued to burn. The cries of the dying mingled with the crackling of the fire, and the smell of smoke filled every street, every building, every house, while the prophetess Cassandra stood in the temple at the altar of Athena. She stood motionless, and her face, pale and calm, was as empty as her eyes, which had seen what others did not see, and which now looked upon the flames devouring her city, and knew that this was exactly what she had foretold, exactly what she had feared, exactly what was inevitable. She did not try to flee. She did not try to save herself. She knew that her fate was predetermined, that her curse was inevitable, and that she could not escape what was meant to happen. She stood at the altar, and her lips, when she whispered words addressed to the goddess, were as dry as her hope, which had long since faded. She prayed to Athena and asked her for mercy, for her death to be swift and painless. She knew that her time had come, that her fate had been decided, and that she could not change what was meant to happen. She heard her city dying. She heard the fire devouring the houses, the walls crumbling, the people she had known since childhood perishing, and she knew that all of this was part of what she had seen many years before, when she was still a girl, when she first opened her eyes and saw the future that could not be changed. And when the Greek warriors burst into the temple, when their shadows, huge and dark, fell upon the walls, and when she saw among them the one she feared most, her heart, which had been so calm, missed a beat. It was Ajax the Lesser, the son of Oileus, whose brute strength and insolence were known to all, and whose hatred for the Trojans burned as fiercely as the fire consuming her city. He saw her at the altar, and in his eyes kindled that same greed that was in the eyes of all men who saw her beauty. But in his gaze there was something darker, more dangerous, something that knew neither fear nor respect for sacred places. He seized her, and his hands, when they touched her body, were as rough as the stones from which the walls of her city had been built. She tried to resist, tried to hold on to the altar, but his strength was too great, and he tore her away from the altar, from that very goddess from whom she had sought protection, and threw her down right there. And then, in that very moment, when her body touched the cold stone, the statue of Athena turned its stone face away. Its eyes, carved from marble, which had always looked upon the altar with the same calm wisdom, were now turned aside, as if it could not bear what was happening in its own temple. It could not look upon this. It did not want to see it, and it turned away. He defiled her right there in the temple, at the very altar where the traces of her prayers had not yet cooled. He did this without being troubled by the presence of the divine image, without fear of the wrath of the gods, without thought that violence in the temple was the most terrible crime a mortal could commit. And while this was happening, the statue of Athena remained turned away, and its stone face, as it looked into the emptiness of the wall, was as empty as the eyes of Cassandra, who lay upon the cold stones and knew that this was exactly what she had foretold, exactly what she had feared, exactly what was inevitable. When he left, leaving her lying there, she did not weep. She simply lay motionless. She knew that Agamemnon, who now stood at the entrance of the temple, would see her beauty and make her his concubine and take her with him to Mycenae. She knew that she would share his fate, that she would die with him, and that her death would be as tragic as his. She knew all of this, and she was not afraid, because she had long ceased to fear death, which was for her not an end but a continuation of the same path she had begun many years before. When the city had almost finished burning, when the cries of the dying had begun to fade, giving way to that strange, almost tangible silence that follows a battle, Menelaus walked through the corridors of Priam's palace, and his steps, as he trod upon the marble slabs, were as heavy as his breathing. He was searching for her, the one for whom he had begun this war, the one he had loved and hated at the same time, the one he had lost and now must find, either to reclaim or to destroy. Helen stood in the corner of the room, by the very window through which the gray light of morning was already penetrating, illuminating her face, which was pale as marble. On the night of the siege, all her children by Paris had died, and now she did not try to flee, did not try to hide, did not try to defend herself. She simply stood motionless, her gaze devoid of fear, devoid of hope, devoid even of that remorse which might have softened his anger. Menelaus stopped in the doorway. He looked at her, and thoughts flashed through his mind like lightning. He thought of 10 years of war, of thousands of dead, of those who would never return home, of those who remained lying on the battlefields, and of how all of this had begun because of her, because of this woman who now stood before him and looked at him with that same emptiness with which a person who no longer hopes for anything looks upon the world. He stepped forward. He wanted to kill her. He wanted her to pay for all those years he had spent away from home, for all those nights he had spent without her, for all those tears he had shed thinking of her. He wanted her to feel the same pain he had felt when he learned that she had betrayed him, when he learned that she had gone with another, when he learned that she had preferred to him a stranger, a foreign city, a foreign life. He raised his sword, and its blade, as it flashed in the light of morning, was as sharp as his anger and as cold as his heart. He raised it above her head, ready to deliver the blow that was to be her end. But when he looked at her, when he saw her face and her eyes, he understood that he could not end her life. His anger suddenly vanished, leaving behind only emptiness and weariness. He could not hurt her. He could only forgive her, and this forgiveness, which should have been an act of mercy, was an act of weakness that he could not explain even to himself. He lowered his sword, and he said, his voice as quiet as the whisper of the wind in dry grass, "Return to Sparta. You are free." She walked out of the palace, stepped onto the deserted shore where the Greek ships already stood, and did not look back, because she knew that her past was behind her, and that the only thing she had was a future she did not know if she could accept. All the Trojan women, those who had survived, those who had not been killed in this inferno, were gathered on the square before the palace of Priam. They stood in silence, and their faces, when they looked at the ruins of their homes, were as empty as their eyes, which could no longer weep, because all tears had been shed during these long years of war, these long years of waiting, these long years of fear and hope that had finally died. There were many of them, hundreds of women who had once been queens, priestesses, wives, and daughters, who had once known what happiness was, what love was, what peace was. Now they stood in torn garments, their hair tangled, their faces smeared with ash and blood, and their voices, when they began to weep, were as quiet as the whisper of the wind in dry grass, and as bitter as the smell of smoke that still hung in the air. They mourned their husbands, who had died on the walls defending their city, their sons, who had died trying to save their families, their fathers, who had fallen in the madness that had consumed them all. They mourned their homes, which had been destroyed, their gardens, which had been trampled, their lives, which had been torn apart. And among them was Andromache, the widow of Hector, that very woman who had once been the wife of the greatest hero of Troy, that very woman who had once held her little son Astyanax in her arms and looked at him with that same hope that was in the eyes of all mothers. Now she stood among the other women and looked at the ruins of her city. She had lost everything: her husband, who had fallen at the hand of Achilles, her son, whom the Greeks had thrown from the walls to end the dynasty of Priam, and Troy itself, which had been her home, her life, her fate. She had lost everything, and the only thing left to her was the memory that once she had been happy. The lament of the women rose to the sky, where the gods who watched this sat upon their thrones and looked upon the city they had once built, and which now lay in ruins. They did not intervene, did not comfort, did not save. They simply watched as their own creations destroyed each other, as those they had once loved perished, and as their lament, when it rose to the sky, was the only thing that remained of their greatness. And when the Greek warriors began to lead them toward the ships, when their hands, rough and strong, seized their shoulders and dragged them toward the shore, they did not resist, because they knew that their struggle was over, that their city had fallen, and that their lives now belonged to those who had won. They walked toward the ships, and their voices, as they wept, grew quieter and quieter, and their tears, as they fell upon the sand, were the only thing that remained of their hope. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the horizon, on the ships that were already preparing to sail, stood Cassandra. The curse that had pursued her all her life had finally come true. Troy had fallen, but victory was bitter. It was bitter as wine that has stood too long in an open jar and has now turned to vinegar. It was bitter as that memory which remained with those who had lost their loved ones in this war, and which now, when the war was over, began to seep into their souls, as water seeps into the cracks of an old ship. The victors stood on the ruins of Troy, and their faces, when they looked upon what they had done, were as empty as the faces of those who do not know what to do next. They had taken what they wanted: gold, slaves, glory, but they had lost what was more important, and now, when it was all over, they were left alone with their victory, which was like defeat. They sailed from the shores of Troy, leaving behind smoke, ash, and silence. Each of them carried within himself that very bitterness of victory, which was their only reward for 10 years of war. But their stories do not end here, on this ash heap. The fates of Agamemnon, Menelaus, Odysseus, Helen, Cassandra, and all those who survived this war are separate stories, full of tragedies, wanderings, and unexpected turns. We will leave them here, on the ruins of Troy, when the night had already begun to yield to morning, and the first rays of the sun illuminated their ships, sailing toward new destinies. Their journey home is only beginning, just as for us, the night full of dreams is only beginning. If you wish to know what happened to Agamemnon after his return to Mycenae, what trials awaited Odysseus on his 20-year journey home, and how the fates of Cassandra and Helen unfolded, we invite you to watch other episodes of our playlist, The Trojan War. There you will find the continuation of these stories, stories of revenge, of forgiveness, of love, and of how sometimes, even after victory, the road home proves to be the hardest. But for now, we remain here, on this shore, where the wind dies down and the night covers us with its warm blanket. The ships sail out to sea, and their silhouettes dissolve in the morning mist. And we, like them, set out on a journey of dreams, where there is no war, no pain, no loss. Good night.